Everyone's made mistakes, needed a little help, gotten lost. And then there are those who help us find our way back. Shepherds, who help us face the questions we don't have the answers to.
So, how do I get started again and do this all on my own shoulders? That's a major, major challenge.
There are so many people out there shouldering challenges the rest of us can't imagine, all on their own. Who's out there to help them? Few cities embody the grand, if sometimes elusive, promise of a land of opportunity more than New York. Ever since it was set up as a Dutch trading post nearly 500 years ago, New York has been making people lots of money. Yet wherever fabulous wealth exists, poverty is just around the corner. New York is no different. And when someone's really down and out, needs to get back on their feet, they could use a little help, a little guidance, a little shepherding.
And that's one of the roles given to Jesus in the Gospels. Multiple times he's referred to as a shepherd. Now, a shepherd's job is, of course, to guide and protect his sheep, to guide them to food, to guide them to water, to give them shelter. Now, today in this city, there are plenty of people that have that and much more. But there are also those that could use a little shepherding.
I think all of us have been guilty at some point of looking at people through broad, easy labels. Terms like ex-con, poverty-stricken, homeless, single mother. Those aren't easy labels to live with. Now imagine life bearing all of them. How could you possibly navigate life all on your own? Thankfully in New York, they might not have to because of people like these three women. I had the immense privilege of speaking with Kathleen Jacob and Gail Lewis Williams of Sister Friends Galleria and Sister Janet Kinney of Providence House. Let's start with her.
Providence House is what I think a wonderful organization that's been around for 36 years. It's a story of women helping women. We serve women and their families, women who are coming out of prison, families who have experienced homelessness or have been abused, and we also now provide permanent supportive housing in 3 of our locations.
After an agency refers a woman to Providence House, the work begins. Not only to find them a home, but to provide the tools to get them and their children back on their feet.
And then once they come to us, we have a full cadre of staff from residence managers who oversee the day-to-day living experience in each one of our residences, to our housing specialists, our employment specialists, who help them identify what their particular needs are, and then create a plan with them of how they want to move on with their lives, not only with finding a job, getting their children placed in the appropriate school placements, as well as them finding the appropriate housing.
So it's not just, here's a house, bye.
Yeah, exactly. It's that network.
And that network includes Gail and Kathleen of Sister Friends Galleria.
And what our mission was to help women with children who were moving into permanent housing to either furnish their apartments, or since that's our long-term goal, now what we do is give them like welcome baskets when they first move in. So this is like welcome home.
It's a lot of, it's not just goodies for the moment. We give them an iron, an ironing board, a mop, a pail. So things that they'll be able to use. And I also think it gives them a message that we respect them as homeless. They want to have a home. They want to take care of it. They want to iron their kids' clothing. You know what I mean? So I think there's also a message in some of the stuff.
And having people that believe in you to rebuild your life means so much to a person living with the societal shame and labels that come with their situation, as Gail pointed out.
And another challenge for them is the stigma that's put around them, because they need help or they're in situations. People think that they're different than who they are because of the stigma around being homeless and stuff like that. And that's a challenge for them to show that I'm not who you think I am. I am bigger than that. And I have a lot more going for me than, what you're allowing yourself to see.
Yeah, they're more than just homeless or any
Right.
label.
Any label.
Yeah.
Any label.
Exactly.
The stigma that comes with some of the labels we as a society place on these women, they're dangerous because they dehumanize them and put them in a box that we would never want to live in ourselves. But when you can look at someone that feels stigmatized and tell them that you believe in them and help them up, you can change their life forever.
In Luke's Gospel, Jesus makes an extremely bold pronouncement. Blessed are you who are poor, for yours is the kingdom of God. For Jesus' audience, this statement would have made a tremendous impact. You see, in first century Palestine, there were 4 groups of people that were considered rich: Roman bureaucrats, landowners, priests, and tax collectors. These 4 groups represented about 5% of the population. Everyone else was poor. There was virtually no middle class. In addition to the harsh daily realities of poverty, the poor person in Jesus' time also had to deal with the religious stigma that came with it, which was, if you're poor, it's because that's how it should be. God does not have favor on you. In a society in which a select few had very much and a great many had very little, Jesus' radical declaration proclaimed that God did have favor on those who felt powerless. It would have been a startling revelation to a population that felt cursed and demonized.
If someone were to come up to you and say, these women made their choices, they chose to drop out of school, they chose to get pregnant in some cases, they are living in the result of, in the consequences of choices that they made, their situation is their responsibility, their problem, what would you say?
Well, for me, I would say that, first of all, everyone deserves a second chance. Everyone in their life at some point have made mistakes. And they were given the opportunity to start all over and try again. So why shouldn't these women have the opportunity to do the same thing? Yes, they made mistakes, but they can learn and grow from the mistakes that they have made.
For some of us, we've had the good fortune of having a supportive network around us of others that we could rely on to pick us up. And not everyone has those relationships.
Compassion is important, as is having a network of people that can pick you up. But then Kathleen raised another point. The perspective I'd raised was just plain wrong.
I was going to say, and also that's a value judgment, because sometimes they haven't made the choice to be in that situation. Sometimes the situation has found them. You could be homeless because you're in a fire. You could be homeless for many reasons, and, that's not their choice to be that way. And I think for people to do that is what takes away their hope that things could change because, I'm afraid to say I'm homeless. I'm a small child in school. I don't want to tell the teachers that I live in the shelter down the block. And that's not something that child has chosen.
And something very beautiful happens when your judgment is cast aside and you try and see a person for who they are.
We're all in this together. If you can remove the judgment, and see the blessing of the person in front of you. It's a two-way street, this relationship. It's not just about Providence House or Sisters Friends doing all the giving. There's a give and take there, that develops.
And working with women that are often judged or labeled or pitied has shown them that actually they need to be admired.
And one of the things for me that I get from it is if you ever want to know the power of the human spirit, watch one of these women who have come through so many different challenges, tap into her strength to make it and move on. Exactly. It's a gift. Wow. It's very, very powerful to watch that.
And Kathleen has also been impacted by seeing that strength firsthand.
I always got more than I gave because I would leave and say, gosh, I wish I had that strength, or I wish that I'd be able to overcome that and not be an angry person. So I always felt I got more than I ever gave.
When I asked what preconceptions might need to change for us to see more of this in the world, Sister Janet emphasized that we need to start by looking at poverty differently,
Well, I think people need to understand that there are underlying causes to poverty, that people don't choose poverty, and as was stated a little bit earlier, circumstances happen in people's lives. Sometimes they're mistakes, but sometimes they're things that are imposed on us. And I think people need to see the intrinsic beauty within the individual person. There's a spark of goodness in everyone, and I think that's what I'd like everyone to remember. We're no different than that person across the room. We're no different. We are all the same. And so to see and choose that common humanity and to support one another in that, I think is a beautiful thing.
What Kathleen, Sister Janet, and Gail do is incredible. Their work makes clear that the poor, the homeless, people who need help, they don't need our judgment, our labels, even our pity. They just need someone who's willing to look at them as a person and give them a chance. I was very inspired by my time with them and left wondering, what would the world look like with a few more good shepherds?
At the commencement of his revolution, Jesus is signaling the beginning of a new era by proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. So, what is the year of the Lord's favor? In this statement, Jesus is making a reference to the Jewish year of Jubilee. According to the Mosaic law, every 50th year would mark a year of Jubilee, a year of universal pardon and forgiveness. Every 50th year on the year of Jubilee, all debts would be completely forgiven, and all slaves would be set free. It was essentially a giant reset button that was hit every 50 years, allowing the poor, the oppressed, slaves, even prisoners a second chance. When you think about it, it was one of the most remarkable practices in all of antiquity. The responsibility of carrying out this justice was placed upon the leader of Israel, which from the time of David was also known as the shepherd of Israel. Perhaps understandably, this practice had been abandoned by the people of Israel 600 years before Jesus. But in that synagogue, Jesus is making a bold declaration. He is the true shepherd. He is restoring justice for the poor, for the oppressed, for the slaves and the captives. He is bringing the year of the Lord's favor.
Throughout the Gospels, Jesus works tirelessly to fulfill this statement to the neglected people of the world. He fed them, he healed them, he collected money for them, so that people who felt cursed and rejected could see, through the actions of this shepherd, that there was a God who cared about them too. In a world in which the poor were viewed as cursed, the kingdom of Jesus' revolution called them blessed.
In the Gospels, we find that integral to Jesus' revolution is the notion of him as a shepherd, one who came to bring the Lord's favor on the poor, the oppressed, and the down and out.
And not only is there room for them in his kingdom, it's on them that his revolution places the highest priority.
The Bedouins have wandered the sands of the Middle East for thousands of years. Many have adopted a more traditional, urban lifestyle. But some, like these men, continue to live in the tradition of their ancestors. These men are shepherds, and their home is here with their sheep. In this environment, sheep and shepherd both need each other. The shepherd needs the sheep for his livelihood, and the sheep need the shepherd for protection and guidance to pasture. A shepherd's life is difficult and self-sacrificing, placing the needs of the flock above all else. In first-century Palestine, the life of a shepherd would have been very similar. Like these men, a shepherd would have guided, protected, and even lived with his flock. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, lived his life in a similar way. He did not just care for the poor of his time, he was one of them. By all accounts, Jesus would have been very poor himself. In the Gospels, Jesus essentially describes himself as homeless, with no place to lay his head. Instead of setting himself up in a permanent location, Jesus moved among the various peoples of his world who needed his help. A shepherd among his sheep.
It's one thing to hand out help from afar, but when help comes from someone you know, someone who's one of you, it just means so much more. And that becomes someone you're much more willing to follow. I saw that firsthand in my time with Jermaine Thompson, who I like to call the mayor of Hunts Point. As we sat and talked, he was very open about his love for his community and its people.
Hunts Point to me, it means the world to me. It gave me my character, it gave me my drive. And actually it's like, this is the actual hood that where they actually tell you one village raises a kid. Yeah. And I think I lived here 25 years and I wouldn't take it back at all.
I don't think I've ever met anyone who knows his community quite as well as Jermaine. And part of the reason why is he's lived there pretty much his whole life.
Yes, I actually been here my whole life. Yeah. I actually moved from Caldwell. I moved here and I lived with my aunt. I was actually in foster care. Okay. So but I was in kinship, which is a lot of kids don't actually get granted that when they go into foster care.
He knows Hunts Point and its people. And that understanding is fed the work he does at Hunts Point Unity, as he knows that the young kids of Hunts Point especially need guidance.
Yes, they really do, because coming up when we was 15 and 18, we had basketball clinics. We had a gym called Pathways for Youth. We had programs that we was in. Now all they have is a video game, YouTube, World Star. So basically, whatever you imitate that you see that comes out on the street. They have so much free time. You give a person so much free time, they're gonna do something crazy. You know, it's like to the fact of no guidance. Like, say for instance, if you look up to me and all I do is fight every day, what you think you're gonna do once you hit my age? If I fight every day, they're gonna look up to me. I buy sneakers every day, that's what they're gonna wanna do. They're easily manipulated.
And as Jermaine was showing me around Hunts Point, he took me to a spot I wasn't prepared to see. And there I saw firsthand what drives Jermaine to help teenagers in Hunts Point. He took me to a mural for Damian Martinez, who they called Cheese. Jermaine was his counselor, but like a lot of kids in Hunts Point, Damian got caught up in a violent situation and was killed in a stabbing. He was only 17.
Yes, he's one of the reasons why we push a lot for the Stop the Violence basketball tournament.
In the face of something so awful, Jermaine decided to try to do something uplifting for the kids in his neighborhood, to stop the violence.
To me, it's like uplifting people now. You know, it's what so much you can do.
When you really care about a place and its people, you don't run away when tragedy strikes.
A lot of people don't do that. A lot of people sit there like they get something, they move away. Oh, I don't want to come back there. That's not me. I love this neighborhood. Yeah. That's one thing I could never sit there and shy away from. They never turned their back on me, so I don't think I'll be turning my back on them.
In a neighborhood that desperately needs one, Jermaine is stepping up to be the leader Hunts Point needs. One who loves his people and doesn't turn his back on them.
During the time of Jesus, there were chiefly two different groups of leaders. The first consisted of the hated Roman-appointed governors. The second of the Jewish priestly elite. Both groups would have lived here in what is now known as the Jewish Quarter.
In the first century, it was known as Herod's Quarter, and it was the most lavish area in all of Jerusalem, marked by its opulent red roofs and elaborate walkways that separated them from the masses, literally elevating them above the people. The living conditions of these shepherds of Israel could not have been more different from those they were entrusted to guide and protect. The people of Jesus' world were under leaders who had turned their backs on them, who were completely detached, with virtually no meaningful connection to the people they were supposed to be shepherding. Perhaps the most prominent leader of that world was Herod the Great, the king of Judea. He earned the title through his construction of some of the great cities and structures of his time, chief among those Masada, the Temple, and Caesarea, a city located right on the coast of the Mediterranean Sea. In that time, Caesarea was a masterpiece of construction.
Yet, as beautiful and magnificent as this city was, the man behind its creation was one of the most brutal leaders of his time. Herod was infamous for committing ruthless acts for the sake of staying in power. Anyone who posed even a perceived threat at taking his throne, no matter how slight, would be eliminated. He killed his wife, 3 of his sons, his brother-in-law, his father-in-law, his mother-in-law, and a number of other perceived threats. He even murdered many infant boys, all because of a rumor he heard of another potential threat that had been born in Bethlehem. This man was in the position of shepherd of the people of Israel, but instead of concerning himself with his people, he was ruthlessly concerned with his own power.
The leaders of Jesus' world were detached, elevated, and cared only for themselves. But in the Gospels, we find a man anointed directly by God who lived among the people to show them what a true shepherd really was.
One of my good friends, he was murdered too, so his son be out there, he plays. I have enjoyed watching him play. It's coming together, it really is.
Because of Jermaine and Hunts Point unity, the neighborhood is starting to come together. And I'm grateful Jermaine was willing to share that journey with me. I know it couldn't have been easy.
It's kind of emotional. I'm not an emotional person.
For our last stop, Jermaine took me to the court where the Stop the Violence tournament is held. He pointed out the new nets they had installed, talked about how the drugs were starting to clear out of the area, and pointed out the kids impacted by their program.
Like all those kids over there, they played in the tournament. They played.
And then he took me over to meet one in particular, a kid who played in the first ever Stop the Violence tournament, the son of Jermaine's friend who had been killed. Sometimes a place takes more than it gives, but it was a complete revelation to spend time with a leader who's deciding to give back anyway, and to see the people whose lives have been impacted by that choice. I'm honored to have met Jermaine Thompson, the mayor, a leader among his people.
Find out you looking shy.
In describing himself as the Good Shepherd, Jesus also refers to an impostor shepherd, who he calls a hired hand, saying that while a good shepherd lays down his life for his sheep, the hired hand runs at the first sight of trouble. The people Jesus said this to would most likely have gotten the reference to the rulers, the shepherds of their time. Firstly, the political ruler of Judea, King Herod, quite literally bought his position as king, delivering a large sum of money to Rome in exchange for his throne. He continued to pay tribute to them by dedicating this city, Caesarea, to Caesar Augustus, and building temples in his honor. Even the religious rulers of Jesus' time, the high priests, frequently came to power through bribery and financial coercion. The leaders, the shepherds of Jesus' time, did not come to power through legitimate means. They got to power through money.
Jesus didn't pull any punches when describing the rulers of his time. He essentially said, your leaders came to power purely for themselves, purely for their own interests. They don't really care about you. Throughout his life, Jesus didn't seek any acclaim or positions of power. Instead, he lived a life of deep care and compassion for the people around him. The Gospels have a word they use to describe that compassion, splagnizomai.
This is Tabga, the site traditionally believed to be where Jesus fed the 5,000. The Gospel of Mark tells us that when Jesus saw this great crowd, he felt great compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. But the original Greek word that describes that compassion is splagnizomai. The literal definition of this word is to be moved in your inner organs. In other words, Jesus' compassion was felt so deeply that he was moved to physical pain at his very core. This is how a good shepherd feels towards his sheep.
A word we use today that's derived from shepherd is pastor. And pastors don't always get a good rap these days, but I was sure this city had to have some, and I wanted to talk to one. Turns out it does. This is Todd Stout, the senior pastor of Church of the Advent Hope, located right in the heart of the city.
And we're actually on 87th Street between Park and Lexington for those who know New York. Cool. Yeah, right here in Upper East Side. Heart of the Upper East Side.
And pastoring a church in the heart of a city like New York comes with its own unique challenges. New York requires you to engage in the public space. And that actually works out great for Pastor Todd and Church of the Advent Hope because reaching out to the community is big for them.
It's an important part of what we're about.
And they have a lot of different ongoing community programs.
One is Meals on Heels, and that's delivering food by walking it to people's apartments who maybe are unable to get out.
And for a place like New York, in which getting around on foot is almost a requirement, that program really means a lot to people.
Yeah, you're really and believe it or not, there are people who are in their apartments and who have not left in a long time.
Wow.
And if you don't have some kind of service, and we may not be able to provide everything they need, but the idea of a hot, fresh, delicious, healthy meal, once a week is an encouraging thing to know.
Yeah.
And Advent Hope is made up of a lot of people who are committed to serving their community.
Because we have people who are very busy,
Yeah.
who have committed to volunteer.
And as the shepherd of that group, Pastor Todd believes that a big part of his role is to support them, to help nurture and grow a sense of community.
Managing and working together with our volunteer leaders is really, really a crucial element of what I'm doing. And that's where maybe I feel like sometimes my biggest burden is to help support them.
And experiencing how much that sense of community has impacted his spiritual life, Pastor Todd and his team work to ensure that their worship experience is filled with that same sense of togetherness.
It is a time when people come together, but it's also a time when people of faith feel like they can bring other people who maybe are exploring faith or maybe have no faith at all at this point.
In everything he does, Pastor Todd tries to nurture and encourage a sense of community and togetherness. And as we finished our talk, I asked him, what drives that? What makes a shepherd good?
Well, I think it starts with what we talked about earlier, in this idea of God having love for us, and that if I'm going to be a good shepherd, I have to have that same kind of love for the people that I've been given to look out for. And when we look at the New Testament and we look at the analogy of the shepherd in the context of Jesus, it's clear that Jesus cared about those sheep. The shepherd cared about those sheep, and he did what he did because he had love and compassion for them, and that I need to have that same kind of love and compassion.
There are a lot of qualities that go into making a good shepherd. But chief among those are love and compassion for the people you're entrusted to take care of. What Pastor Todd emphasized is that love and that compassion, they aren't self-generated. They come from God, and they reveal how He feels about us.
The passage Jesus reads from in the scroll of Isaiah to announce his revolution begins with the following words: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He has anointed me." The leaders of Jesus' time were hired hands, buying and bribing their way into power, caring only about themselves. They were impostors and disappointments. Jesus, the Good Shepherd, was anointed by God to do God's work, showing immense love and compassion on a people who desperately needed it, bringing the year of God's favor.
Jesus said the Good Shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Eventually, Jesus did lay down his life, and hired hands took it. Jesus' revolution didn't eradicate poverty or oppression or desperate need, but it did do something pretty amazing. In showing this compassion to the point of death, he displayed what God's favor is all about. He showed the world that anyone who's poor, suffering, hurting, God feels your pain and wants to do something about it. All he needs is a few good shepherds.